Now let's talk about the SolidWorks user interface. Now I personally think the UI in SolidWorks is one of the best around for a few different reasons. The first of which, it gives you a lot of customization. So we can customize the user interface to suit our needs. And the other is it gives you a lot of different ways to access the tools you need. Now through both of those, the UI customization and the way you can access the tools, it can make for very efficient modeling. But I see a lot of users start learning SOLIDWORKS and they never customize it to suit their needs. Now, I probably save quite a bit of time modeling just by customizing my user interface. So in this video, we're going to talk a little bit about where things are inside of the SOLIDWORKS modeling window. And in future videos, we're going to talk about how to customize it to make it work best for you. Now, because you are a new SOLIDWORKS user, you won't necessarily know what works best for you until you start modeling a few things. But that's okay because I tend to customize my user interface quite a bit. And SOLIDWORKS has made it nice enough that we can copy all the settings that we create, all the things that we change, and save that out so you can swap them out whenever you need to. The first thing I want to talk about, and that's probably the most important area inside of here, and that's going to be the Feature Manager design tree. Now, this is going to be where you access most of your data whenever you create a sketch or a feature or anything inside of your modeling environment. It's going to be located in this tree. Now, this tree is the bread and butter of a parametric CAD system. This is the history tree. Everything is lined up in order that you create it, and then it gives you access to those features. You can move them around in essentially their timeline, and you can figure out how the model is created by where you place these and how you edit them. You will notice that there are several folders at the top of this, and when we get into actually creating some parts, we can talk about these a little bit more. But we do have customization options here as well. We can show and hide different things, make some come on only when they're needed, and so on. But inside this area, the first tab is going to be where you access your part or your assembly. Now, in this case, we're inside of a single part. The next tab over is the Property Manager. Now, currently nothing is viewed here, but whenever you create a feature or you're inside of the editing of a feature or a sketch or whatever it is, all the information about whatever you're selecting is going to be located on this Properties tab. The next is the Configurations Manager. Farther down the line in our series, we're going to talk about configuration, so don't worry too much about what this means just yet. But I do want to just make note that you have access to the configurations as well as display states on this tab. Next over is your Dimension Expert Manager. Now, the Dimension Expert is a tool for those that know how to use it. Now, we're not going to cover it in our series because it's a little bit more of an advanced topic, but if you want more information on this, certainly go into your help file, search for Dim Expert, and figure out if that works best for you, whatever you guys are deciding to model, and then you can make use of that tool as well. The next one over is the Display Manager. This is where we get access to things like appearances, decals, as well as cameras and lights and any scene traits that we add. Currently, there's nothing here because we have no appearances, we have no solid bodies. But later on down the road, when we start to add appearances, materials, cameras, lights, things like that to our parts and our assemblies, then this will start to make a little bit more sense and it'll populate and we can talk a little bit about what we do inside here. So that's an overview of the Feature Manager design tree, but there's a little bit more to it that a lot of people don't use. Over to the right, you'll notice that there's a little right arrow here. Now, if we click that with our left mouse button, it brings up a few more options. Now, the first one is hide and show. This is a very quick way for you to do things like hide your sketches, hide features, or hide solid bodies or the entire model altogether. The next one over only really makes sense when you start to have solid geometry. For instance, if we extrude this, now as we look in this column, we can do things like modify the appearance of a solid box. We can leave it as default, we can change it to shaded, we can do wireframe, we can do hidden lines. So these are great ways that we can modify how things look to us. So we're going to go ahead and leave this as shaded with edges. We'll expand this and we'll make sure that our sketch is hidden. So now you can see that we've changed the way that this part is displayed. The next one over is for appearances. Now by default, it's going to give a shiny plastic appearance to this model, but we can modify the overall part or assembly or individual solid bodies or surfaces by modifying the area in this column. The next one over is for transparency. So in this case, we could make our box transparent so we can see through it. This is very handy if you're using multiple bodies in a single file, or if you're dealing with an assembly and you quickly want to change whether or not you can see through that part without applying a clear or translucent material. So again, this is something that not a lot of people expand or really know about, but it's very handy. And once you get into modeling, if you expand this, you'll find that it makes quick work of doing things like hiding and showing sketches, features, bodies, as well as modifying their appearance or just how they look on the screen. The small dot that you see here allows you to move this back and forth, and the small dot at the top allows you to move things up and down. Now, again, this is something that not a lot of people know. If you grab that dot at the top and you move it down, you end up having two trees. Now, all the information is still the same, but this allows you to do things like have the Properties tab open in one, or Configurations, or even the Display Manager. Now, if we simply drag it to the top, you'll notice that we just have that single tree again. This doesn't duplicate anything that you've created. It doesn't automatically add more features or sketches or anything inside of your part. But what it does is it allows you to access multiple tabs from a single place. Now, moving on, I want to talk about a few more areas inside of the SolidWorks user environment. We already briefly touched on the top toolbars where we have our file, edit, view, and so on, as well as some of the other options in here. But before we created a file, most of these were grayed out. Now that we have a single solid body, you'll notice that we have save document, we can print. If you expand this, you'll notice that we have print preview and page setup. We also have things like the undo option. And it's really nice because when we hover over this dropdown, you notice that it shows a lot of the things that we've already done. We also have the arrow, and the dropdown shows you that you have different ways to select things. You have options for power selecting, and you'll notice that there's also a lot of grayed out options that turn on depending on what you have on your screen, what your model is doing. So again, great access to a lot of information. The green and red dot icon here is to rebuild. Now you can use a quick key, Control B, as you can see inside the tooltip that's displayed. But essentially, if you change things, like if you change dimensions in a sketch, or if you change dimensions for a feature, for instance, in this case, we can modify this feature to be 15 millimeters tall. Now, in this case, it automatically rebuilds when I hit enter, but sometimes you can modify parameters inside of the dimensions and not have it rebuild. And sometimes it's a good idea to manually rebuild those. So this is a way that you can manually rebuild your file, make sure there are no errors, that everything is up to date. And then to the right, we have things like file properties and settings, and we'll talk about these in a little bit more detail in a future video. The next area I want to talk about is your command manager. Now, by default, you have a few things turned on: features, sketch, evaluate, dimension expert. If we do things like right click on here, you'll notice that there are several other options for things that we can turn on and off. I'm going to turn off SolidWorks add-ins, turn off dimension expert, and turn off evaluate, but I want to right click and turn on surfaces, for instance. So now this is a quick way that we can access different tools loaded inside of SolidWorks simply by right-clicking and turning different things on and off. In the middle of our screen, we have what's called the Heads-Up View Manager. This allows us to do things like make quick use of changing views or changing display states in our model. For instance, if I want to go to a front view, or if I want to go back to an isometric view. Very quick way that we can make use of some of the preloaded things inside SolidWorks. We can get access to section views, we can get access to different zoom tools, and then we also have access to hide and show items. For instance, if you want to hide and show planes, or if you want to hide and show axes, or different options like curves, all that is located underneath this icon. If you're coming from an older version of SolidWorks, this icon used to be a set of glasses, but now it's an eyeball that is partially obscured on the right-hand side and clear on the left-hand side. We also have some other options for things like appearances, apply scenes, and then some general view settings for things like perspective, or if we want to make this look like a cartoon, if we want ambient occlusion, where we have parts that create shadows on themselves. A lot of great options to change the way your parts look on the screen. The great thing is all of this is customizable. We can add and remove tools from this so we can customize it to whatever we want. The other area on the right-hand side is our task pane, and we've already taken a quick look at this, so I'm not going to go into it in this video, but just know that you have access to a lot of great things. For instance, appearances and decals. We can come in here and we can get quick access to a lot of different materials simply by going into this folder. So it gives us a nice preview, and when you hover your cursor over it, it can show you a larger preview of what the material will look like. There are a few more things that we need to talk about in the user interface. At the bottom of our screen, we have a Model tab. We also have a Motion Study tab, and depending on the add-ins that you have loaded or what you're doing, you can go to multiple tabs such as 3D views, such as several different options when you start creating these files or dealing with assemblies and so on. So make note that you do have access to multiple tabs here. And as we go down the line, we look in the bottom, you see that we're editing a part. When we go into a sketch, you notice that it changes to under defined, and it also gives us coordinates for where our cursor currently is. So under defined tells us that our sketch, and you'll notice that we have blue lines here, but that our sketch is not fully defined. If we want to do things like add dimensions, once we add dimensions, you'll notice that those lines turn black. And this is all stuff that we're going to go over once we get into modeling. But once we fully define our sketch, you notice that it changes from underdefined to fully defined. So this is a great way to keep tabs on your sketch. And again, when we get into actually creating these features, we'll talk about this more in depth. So don't worry that we're grazing over anything here. It's just a quick overview of where you can access information. We also notice that it says mmgs at the bottom, and this is the unit system of the file that we're dealing with. This is millimeters, grams, and seconds. If we expand this, you'll notice that there are a few default units. Inch, pound, seconds, and millimeters, grams, seconds are the two most used. But we also have centimeter, gram, seconds, meter, kilogram, seconds as quick ones that you can select. You can also edit the document units and create your own custom version by manipulating some of the basic values. Again, these are things that we're going to talk about a little bit later, but I just want to note that you can access this information quickly from your modeling window. The last two things that I want to talk about are really ways that you can access different tools. The first way is by right-clicking up here inside of our command manager. You notice that we have a lot of options in here for things that are tools. So let's go ahead and just select one. In this case, I'll select curves. And by default, it's going to dock this somewhere, but this is basically a free-floating toolbar that you can dock in different places on your screen, or you can leave it floating or even drag it onto another monitor. Now, most of the time, I will avoid using these toolbars, but a lot of people like that functionality, especially if you're coming from different programs, such as AutoCAD, where you may have had these tools docked all over the place. Now, for me, I like to leave them off, but just note that you can right-click and you can access almost any of these simply by selecting them. You will also notice that there are a few things already checked in here. For instance, the motion manager. When I deselect that, you'll notice that we lost the tab that was down here going from model to motion manager. If we right click, I can select it again and I can bring it back. You also have other things that are clicked, such as the task pane. Now, we want the task pane turned on for now, but you can turn that off if you don't wish to have it in your modeling window. We also have the heads up view manager. Now, this is what I talked about right here at the top center of our screen. We can again turn that off. If you find it not very useful for yourself, then you can go ahead and hide it or remove the tools and customize it to your own needs. Now let's talk about different ways that we can access tools. By default, the S key is a shortcut key that has a few tools on it. And again, we'll customize this, but you'll notice that it has things like extrude on it by default, extrude cut, fillets, and so on. If you right click, you can also get access to a few things that change based on what you have selected. For instance, we have some zoom commands by default. We also have scene commands. If we expand this down, you'll notice that there are several other things here. We can customize this menu, turn different things on and off, such as current view as and contour select. So that's a quick way to get access to a few things. The other is the quick context menu that pops up. If we select something, for instance, a face, anything that we can do to this face, such as edit the feature that was created, edit the sketch that was used for the feature, and even do things like start a new sketch because this is a planar face. All these tools that are available options pop up whenever you make a selection. If we select an edge, you notice that the selection options are quite a bit different. We can do things like fillets and chamfers that we could do before by selecting just the face. We can also do things like zoom to our selection, which can be very handy when you're trying to manipulate features. One thing you'll notice in SolidWorks 2016 is something called the breadcrumb feature. By default, this pops up on the left-hand side of your modeling window, and this allows you to go back through and figure out what the feature or the face or the edge that you're selecting belongs to in relation to other features or other bodies or other custom properties inside of the SolidWorks file. This is also a great way that you can do things like edit those, because we can select this, we can go back and we can edit the sketch that was used to create it. So that's a new feature for SolidWorks 2016, and it's another way that you can access these tools, things that we need to know.